Get people to take their seats and have their coffee and whatever they like. I'm Alan Blinder of Princeton University and the Peterson Institute. Both affiliations are relevant here. This is the first joint event between Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, which has an office around the corner now, and the Peterson Institute, but not the last. There will be others. The subject for today is, of course, topical, as you all know. The question is whether globalization is in some sort of secular retreat or is just getting buffeted around by some shocks that are causing reallocations, changes in trade flows, and et cetera, et cetera. Blissfully, for both Princeton and Peterson, and for me, so I don't have to do much, we have two great experts here on this subject today. My colleague, well, let's do this in the order of speaking. My Peterson colleague, Arvind Subramanian, who's a senior fellow here at Peterson and was formerly the chief economic advisor to the government of India. And my Princeton colleague, Steve Redding, who's a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton and is also the director of the National Bureau's International Trade and Investment Program, which, as most of you know, puts out quite a lot of very good work in that area. I'm just going to set the stage quickly with 3 slides and then get out of the way so you can listen to the two experts. Let's see. I did that already. So the first slide is about why almost all economists are believers in trade in general, capital flows, globalization. It dates back, of course, to David Ricardo, who taught all of us that trade is a good thing, as if we needed to be taught that. The one thing I want to add here, economists are, of course, always talking about comparative advantage, including me, which I think is one of the great intellectual thoughts in history. We often forget about absolute advantage. That's too obvious. There's a lot of trade that is dictated by absolute advantage. There's a reason why America doesn't grow bananas and imports them from Brazil instead, not to mention rare earths and a whole bunch of other things. So I don't think we should forget that. Globalization enables capital to flow more easily from the so-called north to the so-called south. That we believe is a good thing because the north is capital rich and the south is capital poor. And there's, first of all, an efficiency gain, but also a distributional gain if the capital flows go smoothly in that direction. Problem is they don't always go smoothly. Sometimes those capital flows are severely interrupted, so-called sudden stops. And there's also a difference between financial capital flows, where a lot of people wonder about the long-term benefits because they tend to be flighty, and more long-term capital flows for FDI, foreign direct investment. Globalization should promote technology transfer, and I mean that broadly conceived. I think it does. We economists think it largely does. And probably, this is a throwaway line because this is about economics, not geopolitics, promotes friendlier international relations across trading partners. I don't want to enunciate the false statement that trading partners never go to war. It's not quite true, but it does help reduce those kinds of frictions, as Henry George reminded us many years ago. The next slide is about why sometimes we economists are whistling in the dark because other people are not believers in the virtues of globalization that I've just very quickly outlined. Some of it is ideology that's just hostile to markets in general. A lot of people think of trade as a zero-sum game. We teach economics. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not close to a zero-sum game. That said, there are losers from free trade, as we all know, and as David Ricardo knew. This is not like a new discovery. One blind spot for economists, I think, is that when people think about trade, they think first about jobs and secondly about lower prices. And we sort of do it the other way around. We take pains. I teach Economics 101, and I take pains to teach my student that trade is not about the number of jobs, it's about the nature of jobs and the allocation of labor and other resources from one sector to another. But that's not the popular belief, and a lot of the hostility to globalization is from fear of job loss, which has taken the effect, as it says here, of fueling the fires of populism in a number of countries, including, by the way, the United States of America. We're not by no means immune to that. I mentioned on the previous slide that capital flows can sometimes be a mixed blessing, especially financial flows that are mercurial and can reverse or stop or reverse. A former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve once said, in fact, he said it more than once, that countries shouldn't adopt America's bad financial habits until they're rich enough to afford them. I said that back in the 90s when the IMF was telling all the countries in the world, this is a euphemism, they have to be like the United States in terms of financial flows, and I thought that was a bad idea. The IMF doesn't do that, not because of me, for sure, because of experience. The IMF doesn't do that any longer. So finally, just a couple of questions, and Arvind and Steve will have their own questions to answer. Is there really a broad retreat from trade, or are we mainly seeing reallocations of one kind or another, product to product, country to country? And will this too pass, or is it something more lasting? Is it mainly a reaction to some adverse shocks, or is it something deeper that's not going to go away? And if either of you care to take a stab at it, neither of our two speakers are Native Americans. If you want to speculate on why now both the Democratic and the Republican Party are protectionist, which is not the history of the United States, I'd love to hear that. Probably others would love to hear that. Thank you. So our first speaker is Arvind. And your slides should magically appear.
Okay. Thanks, Alan, for that great introduction. This presentation is based on a forthcoming Peterson Institute working paper with Martin Kessler and Emmanuel Propezzi, which of course itself is an update of a paper on trade hyperglobalization that we wrote 10 years ago. And so this is kind of partly an update of that. I'm going to present three broad facts and then kind of try and pontificate on at least one of the questions that Alan posed at the very end. So the first, it is clear, and in some ways, I'm going to be looking at it with keeping in mind that the global financial crisis marked a bit of a departure from previous trends. So, you can, Steve will take this chart back in time, but essentially what we saw from about the late 80s, early 90s, a kind of torrid phase of trade. We call that hyperglobalization, and this shows that global exports to GDP rose at an unprecedentedly fast pace. It's gone up by about 15, 20 percentage points of GDP over a couple of decades. So it's clear that hyperglobalization is dead, but what follows after is a little bit unclear. So one possibility that we offer is that perhaps hyperglobalization is being replaced by two-track globalization. And this chart shows what's happening to sectoral gross exports as a share of global GDP. The blue line is manufacturing, and you can in fact see mild deglobalization in manufacturing, But actually in services, what you see is continuing globalization, but at a slower pace. So the kind of, from hyper-globalization, we may have gone into mild deglobalization in manufacturing and continuing but slower globalization in services. And if you look at this in terms of value chains, you see it much more sharply. This is a gross exports to value-added exports. And you can see after the global financial crisis, there's a sharp slowdown in that number. And for services, you see continuing globalization. So kind of this two-track globalization seems to be going on. Now, of course, to understand what will happen in the future, one has to try and understand, what these kind of trends represent. So the question really is why, at one level we say, why do we see deglobalization or not? But in some ways, I would argue that the puzzle is why we haven't seen greater deglobalization than we actually have. I say that because if you look at the factors that have turned around after the global financial crisis, first, almost every country in the world, or most countries, most major countries, have turned inward. The US, Brexit, the Trump tariffs, China under Xi has localized for several years now, and India's a country that I know a little bit more about, since 2017, has actually reversed a 25-year-old trend of opening up and has started turning inward as well. So policies became more restrictive. You also saw financial deglobalization. You saw a big change in ideas, reversal of neoliberalism. And Steve is going to talk much more about this, that geopolitics and the COVID shock and the need for self-reliance. So in some ways, all these factors weighed on to bring about the end of hyper-globalization. But one fact which I want to emphasize, which hasn't received enough attention, is that geography itself has, after the global financial crisis, has served to, stall or reverse trade globally. And the key insight here from gravity, I think Alan spoke about what Ricardo taught us. If anything, the most powerful model in trade is the gravity model, which basically tells us that smaller countries trade more than bigger countries, so that if the world as a whole is becoming more equal with many more smaller countries, there is going to be more trade. And in fact, in the period of hyper-globalization, where exports to GDP start rising, we in fact see the world becoming more equal. And that's because, something I'm going to come back to at the end, is we saw convergence in incomes between poor and rich countries. So the world became, there was convergence in income, the world became more equal, and trade went up. And we estimated that about a third of the rise in trade to GDP was because of this geography factor. And sure enough, after the global financial crisis, geography went into reverse. The world became less equal, or the tendency towards greater equality got slowed down, stalled, partly reversed, and that's why we see, trade also kind of having reversed itself. So in some ways, with all these factors weighing on trade and globalization, one could make the case that the surprise is that we didn't deglobalize more, and in fact, in services, we haven't deglobalized at all, and that's something that's worth thinking about. So fact number one, maybe hyper-globalization is being replaced by two-track globalization. I'm going to turn to fact number two, which I'm going to call this the end of disruptive North-South trade. I mean, those of us who've been at the Peterson Institute in the 90s and early 2000s, I mean, the consuming debate was, what is trade doing to the fortunes of advanced countries? Is it trade? Is it technology? And many, very instinctively cosmopolitan, ideologically liberal economists, Allen, Mike Spence, Samuelson, Larry Summers, were all concerned about the impact of trade on some aspect of, whether it was wages, whether it was income distribution, employment, etc. And kind of trade became the villain of the piece, and in part because of what we saw, not just in terms of magnitude, which I'm going to come to, or magnitude of trade with the South, but also the income differentials. So both the Europe, Japan, and the US, the three green lines, were trading with countries much poorer than themselves. So this is a chart which shows for each of these importers what is the average income level of imports, i.e. imports into each of these countries, weighted by the per capita GDP of where it's coming from. And indeed, hyper-globalization was associated with much more trade coming from poorer countries. And of course, the most salient manifestation of this was the China shock. But what we saw after the global financial crisis is basically it stabilized. So disruptive north-south trade, at least in terms of the income level of countries that the major countries, major advanced importing countries were dealing with, that income level had stabilized. And that's why, you see now more, once again, apart from we still have the residue of what happened in the past, but once again, it's AI and technology that are coming back to, to the forefront. And kind of this disruptive north-south trade, it has for the moment kind of stalled with implications for kind of politics and in fact on impact here. Now, as I said, the most salient manifestation of this was, of course, the China shock. And anything we speak about the past or the future of globalization is incomplete without talking about China. And so we'll turn to China. So fact number one, hyperglobalization being replaced by two-track globalization. And fact number two, maybe for the time being at least, the end of disruptive north-south trade. Now, remember, China is also, and I didn't say this explicitly, is also partly advanced as a reason for the stalling of globalization, the argument being that, the incorporation of China and India into the, bringing their labor force into the global market was a one-off, event. And of course, that would have increased trade, but that kind of event is mostly over. And so it's no surprise that, trade has stalled because that bringing in of China and India has kind of happened already. And I'm going to kind of push back a little bit against that idea. But the third set of facts I want to present is, of course, is China. The first, the black line is in fact the measure that Otto, Dorn, and Hansen use. What is, imports per working age adult into the United States, and the orange line is the share of manufacturing and employment. And of course, we saw this rapid decline in manufacturing share. This was the rapid rise in China. And so, of course, we got all these estimates by Otto, Dorn, and Hansen that this was related to imports from China, which is the China shock. For me, it was mildly surprising that, in fact, the China shock in terms of magnitudes has continued, maybe at a slightly slower pace. It's continued, and this is basically leveled off. So in some sense, the economic impact of the China shock, if you think that this was responsible for this, the fact that it continued but this didn't, it's kind of mildly surprising. But I think I want to, focus or highlight what I would call a new China puzzle, which which is related to the future of globalization as well. The red line is China's internal trade to GDP ratio. So during hyper-globalization, we saw that this just rose gangbusters. And after the global financial crisis, it basically collapsed. China's internal trade to GDP collapsed. It halved. However, China's global export market share continued to rise at almost the same pace. In fact, this is overall exports. Today, China's manufacturing share is something like 22 or 23%, rising just like the black line. Now, this is, for me, a deep puzzle as a kind of trade and development economist, is because when the trade to GDP ratio, think of the magnitudes here, the trade to GDP ratio has halved. That happens either if there's a lot of protectionism, because an import tax is an a trade tax, and you get that, or because you get these Balassa-Samuelson type things, because non-tradable sectors have done better than tradables. So, but both of these should actually impair international competitiveness, and if anything, you would have expected China's global export market share to decline, but it doubled. So this kind of is a puzzle, but I think it also offers a clue to the future, which is now I'm going to pontificate on the future of globalization. Now, Steve is going to talk about this to a much greater extent. We know that geopolitics and ideas were serpents in the paradise of globalization. This is the famous term that John Maynard Keynes used to describe the deglobalization that happened between World War I and the start of World War II. Yeah, and he said, the serpent of, nationalism, isolationism, militarism, and imperialism, came into this paradise of globalization. I think the cardinal sin of forecasting is to extrapolate the recent past. And just as it was kind of a little bit too glib to think that hyperglobalization would continue, I think we would be making the same mistake if we were to project from what's happened very recently, that globalization is headed inevitably downwards at whatever pace. Because I want to first remind you that trade today is far from potential. If you take any simple gravity model of trade, it will say that in an ideal world, the trade to GDP ratio should be 100%. We're at about 20%. Technology and income differentials are still going to be a potent force. And the whole China and India globalization stories are far from over. China was first doing unskilled labor, but now it's doing electric vehicles, and kind of therefore there's no reason to think that China's global imprint is suddenly going to collapse. In services, India's global market share is rising, and like China diversified in manufacturing, India is diversifying in services. So I think these globalization stories are yet to play themselves out. Last slide. Yes. So the future of globalization, I think, related to ideas as well. All I want to say is that this is a chart which shows that the black line is convergence, the difference in growth between rich and poor countries. After 150 years of divergence, this trend was reversed from the early 1990s, and it had to do with globalization. So for developing countries as a whole, globalization was the golden era of poverty reduction and convergence, and therefore I think they and the world have an incentive to resist this glib inwardness masquerading as a rejection of neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Arvind. We could have listened profitably for another half an hour, but we have to move on. Thank you very much. Sorry to push you off. Our second speaker is Steve Redding of Princeton University.
Thanks very much indeed, Alan, for the invitation to participate in today's symposium, and thanks, Arvind, to the really thought-provoking comments beforehand, and to the Peterson Institute for hosting us. So hopefully my slides will appear in a second.
Start timing until the slides show.
Okay, here they come. Thank you very much. Are they there? I don't think it's not advancing. It's not clicking forwards. Oh, there we go. Wonderful. Okay, so thanks again, Alan, for the invitation to present here. So today's topic is globalization in retreat. Well, as you all know, the period since the Second World War was an era of increasing globalization on a number of measures. This here is the ratio of exports to GDP over time, all the way back to 1827. But you also see from this figure that the post-war period is not unique. We also see other episodes of globalization, such as the late 19th century. We see this long period of rising globalization. And then you also see that this process isn't inexorable. We also see episodes in history, such as the 1930s, where we see retreats from globalization, falls in the extent to which the world is integrated. So what drove this rapid globalization in the post-Second World War period? Well, we typically think of three main forces. Firstly, multilateral and regional trade liberalization, so tariff reductions within the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and its successor, the World Trade Organization, and regional trade agreements such as NAFTA here in North America. In addition to trade liberalization, we also think technological innovation played a key role, containerization, the computer, the satellite phone, and the internet, all technologies that reduce the costs of interacting at a distance. And then finally, geopolitical and institutional changes. This was an era where we saw domestic reform and opening up in China in 1978, the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, India's liberalization, which brought sort of millions of people integrated into world markets within a relatively short period of time. And what were the distinctive features of this post-Second World War globalization compared to earlier episodes? Well, in particular, the growth of global value chains, the spreading of stages of production across national borders, as in the classic example of the iPad, with which we're all familiar, designed in California, parts made in East Asia, and assembled in China. So what are the threats to globalization? To talk to Alan's topic for today, and is globalization in retreat? Well, we see three key threats which are going to shape how globalization evolves in coming years. The first here is the return of protectionist trade policies here in the United States and in other countries around the world. So this chart here shows the US-China trade war starting in 2018 under the Trump administration, a sequence of waves on tariffs on a number of countries and products, and in particular on China, and those have largely remained in place under the Biden administration. US is not unique. Arvind mentioned Brexit in the United Kingdom, which can be interpreted as a step back from globalization. And then the World Trade Organization itself faces challenges. Its appellate body is no longer functional after the US has sort of vetoed new appointments to that appellate body. So kind of trade policy threat to globalization. What's another key threat? Well, the aftermath of the COVID pandemic highlighted concerns that global value chains potentially leave countries vulnerable to shocks and supply chain disruptions. So we all know about the shortages of critical equipment in the early episodes of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's seen as a sort of a negative aspect of global value chains being spread around the globe. But we often also forget that there's a positive aspect of that. Those shortages were quickly overcome, often through imports of masks and other protective equipment from low-income developing countries. And so actually you could spin this as a success of globalization. And not to say the actual development of the COVID-19 vaccine, which, as Chad Bowen here at the Peterson Institute has emphasized, was built on a highly finely divided division of labor across countries around the world. But nonetheless, we do see these large-scale disruptions to transport costs here, container freight rates on leading routes to the United States. But then thirdly, perhaps the biggest threat to globalization is one that Arvind and Alan mentioned, namely geopolitical concerns, in particular US-China rivalry, and more recently, the Russia-Ukraine war. This has led to a resurgence in industrial policy here in the United States as a key pillar of the Biden administration's policies. And the administration quite correctly points out that markets are unlikely to fully internalize national security concerns. So in some sense, it's natural for a government policymaker to be the one who wants to think about this rather than private markets. But that then raises a very difficult challenge. How do we trade off the economic gains from globalization against national security concerns? And concerns about national security and economic nationalism in the 1930s don't have a kind of a great history to them, are not particularly inspiring. And so one might sort of worry that this concern about geopolitical rivalry could become self-fulfilling and could itself create conflict. And then related to Alan's question about why both parties are protectionist, I think geopolitics there is one key part of the answer. But then I think another key part is the distributional consequences of globalization. Although we know globalization brings aggregate gains for the economy as a whole because it's like a new technology, we get an extra technology. Instead of producing stuff ourselves, we can specialize in what we're good at, sell it on world markets, and get something else in return. That's just a new technology. But like any technology, it has distributional consequences that some groups within society, some regions within society are likely to lose from globalization. And when we sort of think about policy to address these two concerns about globalization and its distributional consequences and national security, it's also worth keeping in mind that often these policies can have unintended consequences. So we may induce decoupling from China directly, but we may not limit our exposure to China in the sense that the third countries from whom we import, such as Vietnam, are themselves heavily exposed to China. And so you can be indirectly exposed to supply chain shocks. And then additionally, onshoring all production is not only extremely costly, but it also doesn't necessarily leave you completely invulnerable to shocks because you lose the ability to source things abroad in the case of a domestic shock. So I'm getting short on time, so I just sort of briefly mentioned, as well as the three challenges to globalization. Where are we now? Where do we stand? Has globalization already come in retreat? Arvind already showed a graph like this. Globalization, trade flows as a share of world GDP have stagnated since the global financial crisis. In some ways, that's really just a return to normalcy. If you look at the period 1979 through to the early 2000s, that was an unexceptional period of rapid globalization driven by these institutional changes like the fall of the Iron Curtain and China opening up. So it's unsurprising to expect some kind of a slowdown. But nonetheless, we do start to observe the first hints of a retreat from globalization, both for trade as a share of GDP overall and for global value chains trade in particular. Perhaps the thing that's most evident, though, today, and this is a chart taken from a recent paper with Gene Grossman and Alhanan Helpman, is that we're starting to see a great reallocation in response to these policies that have become a threat to globalization. So in the aftermath of the Trump administration's tariffs on China, denoted by the vertical line as the first wave of tariffs on China, you see a sharp decline in China's share of US imports, which is the black line on the left-hand side axis, and a corresponding rise in the share of other Asian countries in US exports. That's the gray line on the right axis. Those other Asian countries are a mixture of 13 countries who Kearney 2020 identifies as typical offshoring countries, including, for example, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and a number of other countries in East Asia. So we're starting to see this reallocation, but it's worth bearing in mind that that comes at a cost. Obviously, these countries were higher cost suppliers. Otherwise, we would have been sourcing from them before the policies were introduced. And so that there is actually going to be some real cost to this walk back from globalization. And just some further evidence on this. This is an event study estimate of the impact of the Trump administration's tariffs on import prices in the United States. So these are prices faced by US firms or consumers. The period 0 is when the wave of tariffs was introduced, and if the coefficient is 1, that means that the tariffs have been completely passed through into US prices. And as you can see here, there's almost entirely complete pass-through of the US tariffs into US prices, steel being the slight exception. And so these policies do actually come at a cost of higher prices to consumers and agents here in the United States. How big are those costs overall? So one estimate from history from Japan in the late 19th century is around 7% of GDP. Recent estimates for the United States can be around 2 to 8% of GDP. Sounds like a small number, but 8% of GDP is around $13,000 per household. And with a median household income in the United States of $75,000, if you told a household with 2 kids in school struggling, I have a policy that's going to give you $10,000 extra per year, it's not something that many households would hold their noses at. And so that these gains, although they look small as a share of GDP, they actually can be meaningful. And of course, the question is, what is the distribution of those gains? To whom do they accrue? And obviously, policy can play a role there in helping to redistribute some of those gains and ensure they're felt throughout the distribution. But so as not to run over time, I should finish there and say, what have we seen in the data? The pace of globalization has slowed over time. The largest current threats to globalization, in my view, are actually geopolitical concerns. We're already seeing a great reallocation away from US sourcing patterns from China. It's important to keep in mind that there are aggregate gains from globalization, and how do we continue to enjoy those benefits while taking account of national security concerns is going to be a sort of key question to navigate. And then how do we ensure that the benefits of globalization and other technological improvements, such as AI, robots, other rapid advances, are broadly felt throughout the income distribution? And then thank you very much.
I'm hearing either a jet, no, okay.
Felt like a guillotine above our heads.
Oh, God. And I thought it was an airplane. Thank you, Steve. You dashed through a tremendous amount of material in a short time. I'd like to start with the first question to both of you, if I may, which is your last bullet point on your last slide. if you would each speak about the distributional impacts of trade flows in whatever part of the world you wish to speak of them, and including to what extent they're actually genuine, that it's really happening, or they're myths that they're believed but maybe not really happening.
Happy to take a first stab at that. I mean, I think it's a great question, Alan. One of the big insights recently from recent research in trade is that to understand those distributional consequences, we used to think about them at the US economy-wide level, between, say, skilled and unskilled labor, or between workers in some industries rather than others. But recent empirical research has really highlighted geography as being a very important dimension of those distributional consequences. And so I think there is a lot of evidence that some regions within the United States have been hit hard by, in particular, the China shock, and I'm thinking of the Otto Dorn-Hansen paper that Arvind mentioned. And so I think that's been a kind of key lesson and a key insight. But then, as Alan also pointed out, we also have other examples of regions that have been very heavily hit by technology shocks, such as, for example, the city of Rochester, where Kodak was based, has been extremely heavily hit by the invention of digital photography. Very, very extreme, concentrated industrial decline in a city that was sort of specialized in that and other related industries. And so my own personal view is that we should really think about, I think one can make a case that when individual workers make their choices of what degree to get in college or how much to study, they may not fully internalize the kind of winds of technology and trade. And so there could be a role for government in providing some sort of temporary insurance to help workers weather trade shocks or technology shocks. But that policy really should be equal between trade and technology. There's no reason for singling trade out. It's often just a scapegoat because it's easy to blame foreigners. We have large-scale distributional consequences of technology. And I think it's actually really important for us to think about that. And what's a policy one could try? My own personal view would be policies such as those adopted by Denmark are actually extremely successful in the sense that they're very focused on helping workers retrain, on helping them reallocate, providing temporary unemployment insurance, but it being contingent on having a plan, moving towards another productive source of employment. Because I don't think giving people money purely is the solution, because all of us like to feel we're doing something useful and being engaged. And so I think actually kind of policies that encourage people to move into an area of the labor market where they can make a positive contribution and actually have a lot to be said for them. That's my own personal view.
And I just, just to complement that, because when we talk about distribution, we tend to focus just on intranational distribution of gains. And in this particular episode, one could argue that the international distribution of gains during the era of globalization was just massive. Just to build on the last slide that I just had, which is that between 1820 and say the early 1990s, about 170 years, we saw a period of what Lant Pritchett called divergence big time, where per capita GDP growth, where basically income levels between rich and poor continued to diverge. For the first time in history, that started converging, beginning in the early 90s for about 20, 25 years. And Justin Sandiford, Dev Patel, and I have a paper on that. And that coincided with the era of hyperglobalization. So essentially, the massive reductions in poverty that we saw between, say, the 1990s and the 2015 was a lot due to the causation from, developing country per capita GDP rapid growth, because partly facilitated by the fact that China and India and others could export so much more. So markets were open, they they liberalized, and then their economies grew very rapidly. So average, not only did average per capita GDP rise, massively. Of course, there was some income distribution consequences in these countries as well. There was an increase in inequality in these countries, but in these countries you saw all three things: widening inequality, big lifting up of people at the bottom, and median incomes going up quite a bit as well. So I think the international gains were kind of should not be overlooked when we talk about hyperglobalization and what follows.
Thank you. I meant to give each of you a chance to quiz the other if you feel the need. You do. Go ahead, please do.
Yeah, I have a question on this, Stephen, which is that why, maybe you've thought about this, and I'd love to hear your views, which is that, the Otto Hansen, what this communities, geography, etc., was the important result. But it seemed to me that they analyzed the period until 2008, 2010. Thereafter, the import shock continued, and yet no talk of regional, geography-based, distributional problems. Why was that the case?
So that's a really interesting question, I think a very important question. And this actually has a parallel not just in the United States, but also in Brazil, where you see it even more clearly. So Brazil had a very large trade liberalization in the late 1980s, but Rafael Dix-Canero and Brian Kovac have a paper in the American Economic Review where they show that after that one-time shock, and I think it's even clearer than the China shock because it's a one-time shock, whereas obviously China's kind of a serially correlated shock over time. So in Brazil, you have this one-time shock, and Brian and Rafael show that up to 18 years later, you see this continuing decline in the regions that were particularly exposed to that shock in terms of having the biggest tariff reductions on the industries concentrated in those regions. And so why is that? Well, I actually do have a paper related to this in Econometrica earlier this year, where we sort of make the point that if you think about a region that has a negative trade shock, what is that going to do? Well, as people lose employment there, some of them might move into other industries or potentially move across regions. But as they move in other industries, what does that do? It reduces the productivity of capital, or move to other industries, again, reduces the productivity of capital. And so it leads to a kind of gradual decline in the productivity of capital, which is a durable asset. And so even when you have a trade shock, it takes a while for the full effect of the shock to be felt because you're running down durable assets such as capital and other durable structures. And of course, and for example, in our paper, we find you can have the time taken to reach the new steady state after the shock can take decades because of these complementary adjustments. And it's not just physical capital that can be a mechanism like that. Agglomeration economies, other kind of public investments can also be a mechanism for why a kind of a temporary shock can actually have more long-lived effects than the shock itself. One of the really big puzzles in the US is why we don't see more mobility between regions in response to that trade shock. That these regions that have been negatively hit by the China shock, we see relatively less mobility of people between regions. That's still a little bit of a puzzle in the literature, and that's despite the fact that if we look back in US history, we can obviously see episodes where there were very big internal movements of labor, such as perhaps most famously the Great Migration of African Americans from the south of the United States to the Midwest and the Northeast. And so it's still a little bit of a puzzle why in the past we see those big movements of people, but today we start to see less population mobility within the United States.
Thank you both. I've got one more question, then I'm going to open it to the floor, which is going back to the distributional aspect. The basic lesson that we teach our students is that trade and other liberalizations enlarge the pie, and therefore, in principle, everyone can be better off. In practice, that doesn't happen, and negligible to zero compensation is made to the losers. So this is a two-part question. The two parts are politics aside and politics not aside. If you were advising the government of India or the government, if you can pick the UK or the US, what would you suggest?
That's a really hard question. I mean, it relates to Alan's question about why both parties in the United States are protectionist. It's quite striking if you look at the growth of US GDP since the 1970s. We obviously see vast growth in real GDP at the aggregate level. But if you look at the growth of the median earnings, the real earnings of the median worker, that's actually exhibited relatively little growth since the 1970s. And I think that a lot of the kind of current political turbulence is sort of related to that fact that we have a situation where the economy as a whole is obviously growing rapidly, and some groups within society are gaining a lot, but the median individual within society doesn't feel that they're gaining from the process. And I've been talking about growth there, and Alan's question's a little bit about international trade, but I think the two are connected. And so my own personal view, but it may sound too political, but I just think one has to sort of, as a citizen within society, one has to feel that one benefits from the existing system. And I think something's a little bit wrong if the median person within society is not seeing their earnings grow in real terms since the early 1970s, whereas the economy as a whole has obviously grown massively. And I think economists have a bunch of standard policy tools that we know how to kind of address that. They are obviously going to be, people of different political persuasion will obviously disagree about the desirability of using those tools, and that's fine. But I think we should just all be aware that there is this sort of process where redistribution is not happening and there are people not benefiting. And at some point, that is going to create potential political challenges.
It already has.
So Alan, I would, the Indian experience actually speaks to your question, but in a very interesting and different way. So when hyper-globalization and this rapid growth happened, in fact, that was the period when, this was in the aughties, 2000s and early 2010s, the Indian policymakers realized that, because some of this is highly unequalizing, because services-based growth, skill-intensive people benefit more than unskilled. So actually, the first big effort at creating a social welfare or social protection mechanisms in India actually happened during and because of, with the very purpose of actually saying that, not everyone is going to gain, therefore we need to build up this social protection thing. And, India embarked on 2 or 3 major near universal schemes to actually address that. So in that sense, politics aside, politics not aside, you got a good response. However, thereafter, in the last 5-7 years, it's been a case of the Bourbons, you forget nothing, you remember nothing, that India forgot that the basis for the dynamism was partly the opening up and so on, and India reversed course, not because, some sense that the gains were not trickling down, but in a sense not, kind of fully internalizing the fact that India was, for 20 years, an East Asian tiger like, before. And it was not just services that grew rapidly in India from the mid-90s to today. It was actually manufacturing as well, but it was all high-skill manufacturing. So if anything, my advice to the policymakers would not be about the social welfare net or the distributional consequences, but to have forgotten that the pie itself grew rapidly because of this, and therefore to continue with the raising of the pie. Because now all the talk in India, it's gone the other way. We see, universal basic income and cash transfer schemes proliferating, spectacularly. So it's as if, we've focused more on the social protection and the distribution side and forgot the pie becoming, how the pie gets bigger.
Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your expertise. There's a fair amount of expertise here in the room. So I'd like now to open the floor to questions. There's a roving mic right there, and there's a mic in the middle of the room. Let's do it. Maury's at the back. Oh, please identify yourself as you come to ask your question.
I didn't want to come up to the mic without your permission, Alan. So I'm Maury Opsfeld, Peterson Institute. We were just discussing trade and redistribution, and it makes me think of a recent NBR working paper by Suresh Naidu and co-authors, where they suggest that U.S. voters, at least, many of them have a preference for what they call pre-distribution rather than redistribution. We tend to focus on redistribution as economists, I think maybe myopically thinking about our welfare theorems and our models. But voters may have a preference for a system that systematically generates higher wages, more market power for workers, rather than transfers. Now, I think the dividing line between pre and re is not distinct, but you can imagine how workers might want stronger unions or a manufacturing sector within which you can have easier unionization, or simply not to be vulnerable to foreign shocks rather than having the government come in and redistribute the bigger pie. So I wonder if you could address that possible political issue.
That's a great question, Maury, and I know that paper by Ilyana Kuzemko, one of my colleagues, a very, very interesting paper. It's a great question, and I agree with you that in principle voters can have preferences for pre-distribution rather than redistribution. And I think the key question that one then has to ask, if one does agree with that is then what's the best form of pre-redistribution one could adopt? And so, as you mentioned, sort of unions, minimum wages, that's one form of pre-distribution. Another form of pre-distribution is a sort of active industrial policy for declining regions, so sort of place-based policy. There are a whole range of possible policy things one can adopt. And tariffs is another sort of, it's kind of a mixture of a pre-distribution and a redistribution in some sense. And so I think the key thing to then think about is what is the least cost way of achieving the policy goals that one has in mind. And personally, I think one has much better domestic policy instruments rather than tariffs to bring about some of that pre-distribution. And so if one agrees that pre-distribution is preferred to some degree, personally, I would think that things such as production subsidies or other forms of place-based policy would be less distortionary than tariffs would be. But it's a great question, and it sort of connects with the point that when one thinks about policy, one can't only do that in an ideal laboratory where one says, oh, the best thing to do is just redistribute in a lump sum way. And I think you made a very kind of fair point, which is one that has to think about in the real world, what's politically feasible and what's palatable. But when thinking about that kind of palatable question, I think it's also worth addressing this point of what's the least cost way of delivering that pre-distribution objective. But great question.
Okay. Maury, there's a kind of a developing country counterpart to your question, which I don't know whether you had in mind or not. So if you look at the East Asian successes, Vietnam, Bangladesh, not India, India being the exception to this, which is that when trade liberalization and growth favored unskilled intensive activities, as we know from our textbooks that they should, you got reasonably good pre-distribution. Because the low-skilled labor benefited, so the gains were more widely shared. In India, the problem is exactly the opposite, that the pre-distribution, because it's kind of unusual factor, specialization, skill-intensive, it becomes disequalizing, and therefore, the complications of, whether we should open up or not become a bit more salient. So there is a kind of interesting, kind of development counterpart to your question as well.
Other questions from the floor? There's one right over here in the middle.
Hi, Stan Vorger, AEI. I was wondering, Stephen, if you could talk a bit more about evidence from Denmark and how relevant you think it is to the United States, where, as you pointed out, a lot of the, I think, adjustment issues have a much more of a spatial nature. But in Denmark, half of the population lives in Copenhagen and Aarhus metro areas.
Yep. Absolutely. So great question. You're right. There are many differences between Denmark and the United States, which makes it hard to kind of pick policy from one country and just cautiously apply it to another country. In terms of the main policies we currently have in the United States, so trade adjustment assistance is sort of highlighted as one of the kind of current policies we have to sort of redistribute towards workers that are exposed to trade shocks. Some of the limitations there are it's actually very, firms or workers themselves have to petition for it. It's not obvious that it gets awarded. It's hard to determine is the job loss due to trade versus technology and something else. And so in terms of the connection with Denmark, my personal view would be just to forget about trade adjustment assistance and just make it, assistance to whether your job has been displaced by some secular technological change or something that's clearly beyond the performance of your individual firm to treat trade and technology equally. The Danish system works through, it's financed through taxes, which are then used to help pay for workers to retrain. They pay them temporary insurance, unemployment benefits, which are sort of time limited. So the unemployment benefits are for a time, they expire. And then while taking those benefits, you're sort of committed to be retraining or going back to school to kind of help you find another job. And so I think what I find appealing about the Danish system is it's that combination of the temporary insurance together with the commitment that you are actually going to go back into employment. And that's what I find is so appealing. And what I think is missing a little bit from the United States is that trade adjustment assistance does have some of those features, but it's not as explicit, it's not as fully developed, and it's much more limited in scale, and it's only kind of tied to these sort of jobs where workers or firms can kind of petition and have it sort of declared that this is a trade-related job loss. So I would just find for us to rethink the benefit system in a little bit, which ties sort of benefits towards getting re-engaged in the labor market and linking the two together, so retraining and benefits become a little bit the side of the same coin. I think that at least to me, that's what's so appealing about the Danish system, and it's also something that might appeal to both the left and the right of the political spectrum in some sense, in that the retraining aspect is more appealing to those that are towards the right of the political spectrum, whereas the sort of temporary insurance and temporary benefits is more appealing towards those who are towards the left of the political spectrum. And so maybe putting those together, one could think about something that might actually appeal to both sides of the spectrum. Although I know that's sort of incredibly optimistic, but one could see hope in that direction. But yeah, it's a great question. I'd be happy to talk in more detail. I'm also obviously not an expert on Denmark, but I can definitely share some references on that if anybody's interested.
Did you want to say anything about that? No. Is there another question? I think there were other. Jean in the front. Remind everyone who you are.
I'm Jean Pisani. I'm a senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute. You made a very interesting point about technology and trade when saying that, in principle, policy should not distinguish between the two causes and should treat them exactly in the same way. The reality is that it does not. And the question is why. One explanation is that perhaps trade shocks affect certain communities much more than technology shocks. One explanation is that technology is considered more acceptable. I mean, the transformation triggered by technology is more acceptable. I would wish to have your views on that.
Yeah, great question. I guess I would sort of make 2 points for why technology shocks are typically singled out. So one is partly because it's a direct policy lever that you can see often. You can see a change in tariffs, or you can see a change in trade policy status, such as China joins the WTO or is granted, and then hence permanently granted most favored nation status in the United States. There's a clear kind of discrete policy thing you can point to. The other might be just the sort of political point that it's sort of easier to blame somebody else for one's troubles in some sense. And so blaming a foreign country for job loss can sometimes be appealing. And so whereas technology is a much more diffuse thing to point the finger at in terms of blame, I will though make the point that actually Darren Osamoglu has a very interesting recent book called Power and Progress, where he's sort of talking about artificial intelligence and rapid rates of technological change. And he's actually making advancing a position that we should actually treat technology a little bit more like the way we treat trade, in the sense that he's making the point that the direction of technology is endogenous, that technology can have very large distributional consequences, particularly when it automates tasks, and therefore there can be a role for thinking about who is making the decision about the direction technology change, and there can be a role for public policies to intervene. Those arguments are actually very, very similar to trade, and so I think one could make the case for treating the two equally, but I'd be really keen to see what Arvind thinks about this point as well.
You've been invited.
Arvind
wasn't looking to intervene, but
feel free not
go
to
ahead.
pass.
Do you wish to?
No, I think there's another question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Colin Hendricks here with the Institute. So we've talked about retraining programs and temporary unemployment insurance and the like, but there seems to be a large kind of spatial component to this and a mismatch between where new jobs are being created and where the existing labor force is. What can be done, especially in large geographically diverse countries like the United States, to lower kind of the costs associated with moving? What can we do to unstick people from place? Thank you.
Great question. I want to highlight some work by one of my colleagues in the MBR International Trade Program. So Gordon Hansen at the Kennedy School at Harvard, he actually has a large-scale project together with Danny Roderick where they're trying to engage exactly with your question. They're essentially trying to go around the United States and look at what local governments and the federal government are doing to help places that are suffering from extreme job loss. And they're essentially trying to look for best practice, to look what works, and then try to see how can we be more successful in achieving that. And one of the key lessons that comes out of that, it's not directly related to what you asked, but then I'll mention it and then try to engage with what you asked, is that they say the key thing is to actually play to region strengths, is to kind of look for where there's an area where we can actually make a difference and advance local employment. And so, for example, Pittsburgh has very successfully reinvented itself around education and healthcare. It had both of those originally there, and they've become the fulcrum around which it's tried to relaunch local employment opportunities and build up local employment. And so they tried to, and they have a number of examples of local authorities which have basically followed that model. They've tried to see what's feasible, what can we do that builds with an existing strength, and maybe that's actually a better approach than just having a one-size-fits-all. There may actually be a higher return to tailoring it and trying to link with current existing strengths. The question about mobility is a really interesting one, a really difficult one. It comes up in an urban context as well in terms of moving to opportunity. Raj Chetty has a whole bunch of papers surveying the benefits of those policies within cities, let alone across regions. You know, some obvious things that occur, which you probably is kind of providing information to workers about where opportunities arise. Maybe it's very hard to think I have a location where all my family are, and I'm thinking about moving to another city about which I know nothing about. I know nothing about employment opportunities. You'd think the internet has reduced some of those barriers, but maybe there's a scope for more kind of information provision, just to kind of have nudges that help people see, well, actually, it's not so scary to go there. There actually are opportunities for me. That's the sort of one policy that I would kind of perhaps single out. And there in the past, sort of migrant networks obviously played that role, where there's a lot of evidence that for international migration, migrants from that country already in a place play that sort of information role, and that's already suggestive of a kind of potential scope for sort of information provision. But yeah, great question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to reserve the last 15 seconds to thank our two excellent speakers, Steve and Arvind, for their presentations, for their time, and for their wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.